clear. Don't worry about it. Tonight, we're very happy to have with us Miss Carol Rosenberg and Guantanamo Bay, the Pentagon's Alcatraz of the Caribbean. But here to introduce our author this evening is a very special guest, her friend, her colleague, but more importantly, her editor. Please welcome to the lectern, Mr. Dave Wilson.
Well, thanks everybody. It's great to be here for this occasion. It's our kickoff event for the first publication in a new part of what we publish at the Herald called Herald Books, and it's a partnership we have with Mango Media, which is based here in Coral Gables. We're grateful to Books and Books for hosting our inaugural event, so thanks everyone for making that happen. Before I get on to the really good stuff, I want to explain a little bit about what kind of new venture this is for the Herald. And this partnership is an interesting and different type of publishing. What we're doing is we're using a model that Mango developed with the Associated Press and is now doing with us and with others to mine mostly previously published content, curate it, massage it, make it hang together, and publish it as a book. So we've narrowed in on a number of topics of high interest, and Guantanamo Bay is the first for us. So this is our initial go. And the print and digital formats we think are something that you'll find appealing. There's one big difference, obviously, well, more than one, between the print and the digital, other than the way that you read it. But in the digital, we've been able to mine more of our photographic content and some audio and video recordings to enhance that. So that's a bit of a different reading experience. So the goal of this book that Carol was very involved in shaping was to select a cross-section of the stories that she's written about Guantanamo Bay and what happens there. And some of the most important ones, from the absolute top-line news value to the things that give you the look and the feel, the bit of the experience, a bit of that put-you-there experience of what it is and what is happening there at Guantanamo. We're going to have some more books. The next one we're going to publish with Mango is a Dolphins book, 50 Years of the Dolphins. That'll feature the work of Greg Cody and Edwin Pope and others from the sports staff. And we have some other titles that we're working on too, with Leonard Pitts and Steve Rothaus and Jim Warren and some other folks at the Herald who've got a long and rich body of work in one lane that we think is worth doing. So there's some folks here from Mango Media. Thanks, Hugo and Marva and Chris McKinney, the CEO of Mango, is flying back from New York and probably breaking some kind of Uber law or something to try to get here from the airport. So we think Chris will blow in here before we're finished. We have some Herald people here. Special guest appearance from Mark Seibel from the Washington Bureau, who worked for the Herald for a very long time and is a very close colleague of Carol's and mine, and more Herald people here than I can name, and former Herald people, and several who've been to Guantanamo, and other colleagues, and our professional colleagues from Southcom. Thank you for coming. That's very nice of you. So my Herald career started a while ago. It'll actually be 40 years next week. And I've had a lot of different editing jobs and responsibilities. But I have to say, one of the most rewarding has been serving as Carol Rosenberg's editor. What she does is so important. And it's so difficult. So let me tell you briefly just a few things you might not know about what Carol deals with in covering Guantanamo. She can only go at the invitation of the military. For hearings, that invitation has to come from the Pentagon. To do the reporting she does there in the detention center, well, that invitation has to come from a rotating cadre of public affairs officers that serve at Southcom 9 months or so at a time, and they report up to Southcom. If she wants to go and do reporting on the regular old Navy base, well, she has to do that through the base commander, and he reports to Navy in Jacksonville. Nothing is simple about it. It's really a never-ending exercise in asking, cajoling, lobbying, and at some difficult times demanding access. That's a truly thankless part of Carol's job. Once she gets an invitation, she has to fly to the base. For commissions, that usually means flying from Miami to Washington, spend the night, show up at Andrews Air Force Base in a parking lot by the golf course, right? Before dawn, catch a flight with the rest of the legal teams and others who are going from the Pentagon to go to Southcom. And then, not to Southcom, to go to Guantanamo. And then repeat the process in reverse to get back home. In case you're wondering, yes, there is limited commercial air service from South Florida, and that has occasionally worked for journalists who want to go, but increasingly rarely it's been an option for us. Lately, though, thanks to a much more cooperative posture from Southcom, Carol and other journalists have been flown on small military planes from MIA on brief visits to do reporting from the detention center. In fact, there's one going tomorrow, and there's a reporter here from Law Journal who's, Law Dragon, sorry, John, who's going there. Carol and other journalists sleep in tents, as Jane Sutton, who used to work for Reuters, can attest, when they're there covering court hearings at Guantanamo. I asked Carol once how many nights she figures she spent there since she witnessed the first arrivals in January of 2002. Many hundreds, she said, maybe 1,000. Any pictures Carol takes or audio or video she or any other journalist records at Guantanamo in the course of their work is subject to review and censure by the military. That's true for the work of all the journalists who go there. When Carol reports from Guantanamo, and she has certainly done more reporting there than anyone else in the last 14 years, she is more than just a reporter. She's the eyes and ears of the American people, who have a right to know what's being done by their military and their government. It's vitally important work, and I'm very glad that Carol Rosenberg has been there to do it so well for so long. So that's enough from me. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Carol Rosenberg, the Herald's award-winning military affairs reporter, who will tell you a bit more about her work covering Guantanamo and hopefully answer a lot of your questions. Carol?
So I really prefer to not talk in public. Be gentle. First of all, I wanted to thank you all for coming to essentially support the Miami Herald's coverage of Guantanamo, which frankly is an extremely unpopular and mostly forgotten story. So thank you for coming. Anna said, tell a story. So both Anna said, tell a story. So I was at Guantanamo a couple of weeks ago covering some 9/11 hearings, and for the September 11th hearings, they've been ongoing for 4 years. There are 5 men who are accused of being the plotters, the men behind the 19 hijackers who came and basically caused the event that created Guantanamo as we know it. And the hearings have been going on for 4 years, and we are not anywhere remotely close to a trial. What they are trying to do in these hearings is figure out whether and what the defense lawyers can know about the 3 and 4 years when these terrorists, as they're called, disappeared from the face of the earth into the black sites of the CIA. What happened to them, where they were, and how that implicates any confessions they would give later. And the judge is trying to figure out, who's a colonel, an Army colonel, is trying to figure out the rules of engagement for a court that never existed before. And as Dave explained, we go to Andrews Air Force Base, and we are a war court in a plane. Everybody is on there. The prosecution, the defense, the judge, the censors, the translators, the court officers. In the front and first class are the victims. In the back, by the toilets, are the only people who pay for their seat on the plane, the reporters. And in between, you have the judge, also in first class, the prosecution, the people who are called the couriers who carry the classified information, the translators, the defense attorneys, the NGOs, which are legal observers who are there to see what's going on, and the reporters. And as a reporter, I'm always very interested in talking to the victims. The victims are people who generally lost family on that day. Generally parents and sisters and children of the innocents who died, usually in the World Trade Center. So I was there a couple of weeks ago, and in the one opportunity we had to engage with the victims, a man walked up to me, and he had been buried in the debris of the towers. And he had been pulled out and saved by the firemen. And he said, and he reached across to me and he said, "Carol, tell me, how is it that the Miami Herald covers this story all the time?" And before I really had an opportunity to tell him what I'm about to tell you, his mind just swept him off in one direction, and I went in another direction, and I thought, well, maybe I'll see him at the airport. And he was in the Distinguished Visitors Lounge, and I wasn't. And then he was in first class, and I wasn't. But what I wanted to tell this man was that it is astonishing to me that this newspaper, continues to have this extraordinary commitment to this story. That years ago, Tom Fiedler, the editor, wrote Donald Rumsfeld and said, "We want a seat at every hearing in these war crimes tribunals that you're going to have." And that's because my editor, Mark Seibel, at the time, decided that if they were going to build a court out of reach of the American courts, if they were going to build a prison out of reach of the American courts, if they were going to have a detention center that was unavailable to the public, he was going to do everything he could to make sure it was not out of reach of American journalism. And that means going when we can go and writing when we can't. And it is what you need to know about the man who approached me, David Hanschel, is he was a photographer for the Daily News. He was buried in the rubble of the World Trade Center. And 2 years ago, he was laid off because the Daily News was downsizing. And so if you think about what's happened to American journalism in the last 14 years, through one of the darkest periods of downsizing and re-entrenchment of American journalism in anybody's life in this room, the Miami Herald has continued to cover this story, which is astonishing. So thank you for showing up. And I think that if you choose to read this book, you'll find that it has been an uncommon commitment by a series of editors, some of whom are in the room, to keeping me there and keeping me reporting. Because frankly, we have been smeared, we have been censored, we have been, at one point I was banned for life, we have been threatened, we have been at various times lied about, and weaker men and women would have walked away from this story. And they didn't. So I have some notes here, and then I was going to actually read a little bit about what I do, and then I was going to ask for questions. The one thing I need to tell you is that we are at Guantanamo because not everybody in the military embraces the culture of censorship down there that distorts what the public sees and gets to know. There really are honorable soldiers and sailors who know that this is not just the Pentagon's prison, the Pentagon's court. It's an American prison, an American court. And the American people are entitled to know and receive meaningful answers to complex questions about the challenges, the costs, and the contradictions of this thing that was set up 2 presidents ago and continues to exist through inertia and political maneuvering that has caused, that has thwarted this president's effort to close it. Now, if you read my stories, you know that I don't believe that closing Guantanamo is truly closing Guantanamo, that Barack Obama doesn't really want to close Guantanamo. He wants to move it. So the questions, wherever this prison ends up, would be the same. What happens when you pick up people and move them 8,000 miles and put them in boxes? What happens when you take them prisoners of a war that has no one to surrender? What are the rules of when they can go? What happens when you create a court that decides that you can basically ignore 3 and 4 years of U.S. custody that denied men who are facing death penalties, capital trials, lawyers, and access to the Red Cross? What we need and what we get when we have thoughtful military spokesmen and thoughtful commanders are people who think before they answer. People who aren't robots who recite talking points that we know to be untrue. When I was there last time, the spokesman got up in front of the cameras and announced that there were 79 detainees at the detention center. He knew it wasn't true. I knew it wasn't true. We both knew, as did all of the reporters who were watching, not the reporters, all of the soldiers who were watching him talk to the cameras knew that 3 people had been released before we ever got there. 2 went to Serbia and 1 went to Italy. But for political and diplomatic reasons, they chose not to announce it until after we were gone. They actually had been gone, and I was back at home for, I think, a day or a day and a half before the Pentagon acknowledged that they were now 76 detainees. What I find so troubling about that is not that sometimes the military has to avoid telling the truth because there's an operation underway. What I found so troubling about that is that he looked into the camera and said something, offered it without a question, knowing it wasn't true, and knowing that by the time that TV crew cut that story, they would know it wasn't true when he said it either. And so I think that one of the problems is that the way they handle public affairs down there is to reduce things to the most simplistic kind of facile Vietnam-era relic rhetoric about we are all good and they are all evil. And what I do there doesn't fit into that sort of construct. What I do there is ask substantial questions about substantial things and accept the fact that some questions can't be answered, but do not want a spokesman to look me in the eye or look a camera in the lens and lie. On any given day at this detention center, there are somewhere between 1,950 and 2,200 soldiers and civilians assigned to the detention center, which today, I am confident, houses 76 captives. They are neither these 2,200 people nor these 76 prisoners, 35 of whom are cleared for release, by the way, are caricatures. So what I hope is that this little black and white book of stories that really ranges across the whole experience of Guantanamo helps you to understand that they don't need to be caricatures, that they're real people behind the stories, and that they are people who increasingly, under a regime of blackouts and censorship imposed by a Marine general who is retired, we have no access to. And so, with all respect to the people in the military for whom I have great respect, I'm hoping that they will be able to improve the situation, to somehow wrest away from the people who would reduce it to a caricature, the narrative. And so Mark said, if people come to Books and Books, they expect a reading. So I would like to read something I wrote because maybe it'll be a little bit less nerve-wracking, okay? And, you know, I've done a lot of talking about journalism. So I still would like to do a little, thanks, John. I still would like to do a little bit about what I do and why. And if you get the book, you'll see that it opens with a speech I gave some years ago at Columbia, which was a huge honor. They invited me to talk about my beat. And so I really delivered it really poorly then, so maybe I can do it a little better now. And I'll just do a section. For the last 14 years, I have had one of the most challenging, at times frustrating, rarely boring, and bedrock fundamentally important beats in American journalism. One I never could have imagined, wasn't designed by editors or dreamt up in a news lab. It grew organically out of an assignment that became an obligation and morphed into a beat like no other. I covered the detention center at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba for the Miami Herald, the paper that hired me to report in the Middle East and considers Cuba a local story. Nobody got that in New York. Nobody laughed at Columbia. Most news organizations don't care about Guantanamo, but the Miami Herald and McClatchy believe in this story. I write about a place, I write about people, I write about policy and politics in what seems to me to be the first no-exit strategy U.S. military enterprise since the Vietnam War. I deal with a military that doesn't like to answer my questions, won't talk to me, censors my photos, restricts my movements, routinely threatens to ban me from further visits in a system of military intimidation. And decides sometimes that I should sleep in a tent rather than pay like everyone else for a hotel available to civilian guests. From that tent, I write about an evolving system of judgment, at times alone because no other news organization will make the trek. I'm going in September for 3 weeks of hearings, and I'm told nobody else has signed up. Or in the company of reporters who show up for a ticket punch, a been there, done that dateline, and a swipe at the historic military commissions. Make no mistake, this is a court like no other. Not because the United States seeks to execute 6 men there, 5 for the 9/11 attacks and 1 for the USS Cole bombing. And not because the soldier sometimes sits in the room behind me as I write, even when I'm the only one there. But because we're years into trial preparations for men who were long denied lawyers or Red Cross visits, and the attorneys at the war court still argue about what parts of the Constitution apply. I don't write about what happened to 3,000 people on September 11th or why 17 sailors had to die in Al-Qaeda's suicide bombing of the USS Cole off Yemen. I am certain that my fellow journalists will show up for that part. I write about whether the CIA will ever allow the accused and the world to learn how agents interrogated suspects in nations they won't name using now forbidden interrogation techniques we glimpse only through leaks and misconduct reports. I write about the FBI trying to turn a member of the 9/11 defense team into a snitch, an informant. This is a system that American lawyers in American military uniforms call un-American. This American court has a motto: fairness, transparency, justice. As they close the hearings and seal up filings, the motto sometimes comes to mock me. And I didn't really understand why until Eugene Fidel, the great military justice scholar who teaches at Yale, explained it. If you're really fair, really transparent, really just, you wouldn't need a motto. It would be, thank you. It would be like the founders said, self-evident. But it didn't start that way. It started with a phone call from the Pentagon subsidiary in Miami, the Southern Command, notifying me that it was about to get into the prison business and asking, would I like to come along? It was months after the September 11th attacks. America was scared. Our troops in Afghanistan were overwhelmed with foreign men dropped off and dragged into our outposts by Pakistanis and by the Northern Alliance, by tribesmen looking for CIA bounties, and occasionally by American troops who encountered suspected foreign fighters in their patrols. These captives were cold. It was freezing in Afghanistan. Some were angry. They'd been treated brutally. And they were rather a mystery to us, mostly because we really hadn't practiced the art of military intelligence in a foreign environment since Vietnam, not interrogated in any meaningful way. And somebody had the bright idea to pick them up and fly them 8,000 miles to a U.S. occupation zone in southeast Cuba, where it was hot, sunny, stuck behind a minefield, and the Bush administration thought against all reason, out of reach of American law, out of reach of the Geneva Conventions. I didn't know that it was going to be a place where we'd carry out tribunals whose end game was meant to execute people. I didn't imagine that it would go on for 14 years, 2 U.S. presidents, 5 secretaries of defense, 16 prison camp commanders. The Pentagon was setting up a prison, Donald Rumsfeld's least worst place in my paper's backyard. It was a story that hadn't been written. My boss, Mark, told me to go down there and not come back until it was over. I watched the first 20 men come off a U.S. Air Force cargo plane like a poor man's Hannibal Lecter, in orange jumpsuits and shackles and surgical masks and blackout goggles. 759 more prisoners would follow. 680 some odd would go. 9 of them are dead, and it's still not over. One more part from the speech. Sometimes when I get a little bit lost or wonder, why write about these men who nobody really cares about, except hopefully their families and their lawyers, I remember that the United States government built it to be out of reach of the American people, out of reach of American courts, to make it hard and remote. So we won't think about the fact that it is ours. You know, the military calls Guantanamo the most transparent detention center on earth. Hundreds of reporters have visited there, they say, since the first Al-Qaeda suspects arrived in 2002, the detention center. They skip the part about how few go back more than once, frustrated by the hoops, the time, the costs of doing basic journalism, being a court reporter, writing a feature story, conducting an interview. Sometimes I go back honestly because they don't want me to. A year plus ago, the military decided, after 8 months of releasing hunger strike figures every day, that its transparency wasn't working for them. So now troops down there call the daily hunger strike count classified, a state secret. If you buy the book, you'll find that for years they routinely gave us these numbers. Shouldn't keep pitching the book. But part of it is the fault of American journalism. It's hard to be a reporter at Guantanamo. It takes days to travel there. The military can be abusive or infantilizing. The military supports big sweep features that generalize to the point of being dismissible or dumb down the details. Newsroom money crunchers want crisp beginning and end budget travel. Editors want front page stories that are candidates for prizes. My stories can't be wrapped up with a ribbon and declared done. Guantanamo? Didn't President Obama sign an order to close it during his first year? There are 76 men held captive by a military operation staffed by up to 2,200 federal employees, mostly soldiers. The death penalty trials are just beginning. The 16th prison commander has arrived with his Mercedes. Sometimes I tell a story a day at a time, and I know that's an unpopular thing. Okay? And those really aren't the stories. I think the stories which are not about me and not about journalism will really will surprise you, because it's not all about prisoners. It's not all about hunger strikes. It's about uncommon people who have done extraordinary things extraordinarily well in a situation that really had no blueprint, and that to this day has no blueprint. They make it up as they go along. There is a constant rotation, churn of soldiers, more than half of them National Guard troops, some of them very politicized, who arrive from different parts of the countries on 9-month tours and figure out how to do it, some better, some worse, and move on. What would you like me to do now?
Question time.
Okay.
Folks, let me get to you with a microphone so they can hear you online. If you have a question, I'm sure there's a few. Give me 1 second right here.
I don't have a question. I'm one of these annoying people at the book readings that just wants to talk. But I don't have a question. I just have a statement. No, I just want everybody to know, because you're very modest, something about Carol, because I sat next to Carol for 3 years, from 2005 to 2008. And one day Carol said to me, "Do you want to see something?" And she took me around to all around our pods. There were filing cabinets. Oh. And she had a file on every single detainee in Guantanamo. And she had the details of when they came in and, who they were, as much as she could tell. She's an extraordinarily committed reporter who has done really the impossible with this story, and I'm very, very, very proud to have, shared those years with you, and that you finally have a book that that we can all read about. So thank you.
So the reason those files exist is for the first 4 years they would not tell us who the detainees were, but every once in a while through FOIA, a paper would just splash out onto the world, and they would have numbers of prisoners. And there would be a prisoner 141. And so you'd take all of the pieces of paper on prisoner 141 and you'd put them in a file, and you would realize one day, this is Osama bin Laden's driver. He has a name. He is a person. Now, that was back in the old Herald when we were on the Bay, so we had to pick up and move all the files to the new Herald, which is in Doral. And when the files began, they were all in army green folders because they were all detainees. And as they've left, they've been moved into red folders because they're out there, innocent or guilty. And as they've died, well, they're in green they're in light green folders, which is kind of has some meaning. Yes?
Why did they release those that they released? Why did they try to hide it? What was the point?
Hide the identities of the people?
Yeah, that they did. He overstayed. Time and he lied about it.
Oh, the 3 people who left. I actually have no problem and have always respected the military on the issue of if there's a operation underway and they're moving prisoners from one part of planet Earth to another, they don't want that out there. There is a theory of security that says that the rest of the world hates Guantanamo so much and what it stands for, that if somebody with an RPG rocket on a coastline in trying to pick a country where we would fly these people now. But, in a country where people have RPG rockets on the coastline, knew that there was a C-17 carrying a former detainee there to drop him off for freedom, they would hate what Guantanamo stands for so much. The military believes this, that if they knew that was a Guantanamo plane, they would blow it out of the sky. So I don't really, if you work at Guantanamo, if you're a reporter at Guantanamo with any sense and or repeated experience, you can tell if there's an operation of one sort or another underway. And I don't have any interest in blowing the lid on that. But I don't think, well, what you need to know is I've worked with some very talented spokesmen who didn't have to lie. They just would say something. First of all, they wouldn't offer a false number without being asked, but they might also give a ballpark. Or they might also say, if it was just me and Colonel Costello, he would say, Carol, just ask me that question in 2 days. And so I would understand that there was something that I didn't need to know, and he wouldn't lie to me, and I would have tremendous respect for him. Those 3 who left, one of them was cleared during the Bush years, Omar Abdullah. He was a Tajik, And, part of what's so weird about this job is that I get to know these people, not because I have ever been allowed to speak to a detainee at Guantanamo. It is a lifetime banning offense. But I learn about them through their lawyers. And the former prisoners who I have met, one was in a bar in Toronto, which is a different story, but have called me up, have sent me emails. One guy did a emoji at me the other day. I didn't learn what an emoji was. They don't have a lot of emojis at Gitmo. This guy, Omar Abdullah, was a Tajik, and he was cleared during the Bush years to leave. But he was so afraid, according to his lawyer, of going to Tajikistan, where he was stigmatized for having been at Guantanamo, must be a terrorist, had fled his country for being Muslim, must be a terrorist, that he believed that going back to his homeland was certain death. And so he actually, through his lawyer, got a court order to prevent his repatriation. And so it took years for the Obama administration to getting around to finding a country to take Omar Abdullah. He went to Serbia. He lives in Serbia now. Maybe someday, if they close the detention center, I'll go interview some of these people and write about life afterwards.
Let me get to you with a mic.
You wanted to talk about those three, right?
Two unrelated questions. What is your impression of the lawyering on behalf of the people who are held there? Where do those lawyers come from? Are they inside military public defender types, or are they top Washington, D.C. young lawyers who accept these appointments? And secondly, in your article today, you identified 3 or 4 categories of the remaining 76. I can't recite them. One of them was forever prisoners. Could you just give us a sentence or two on each of those categories?
Thank you for reading my article today. There are 10 people among the 76 who are charged with war crimes, and they are represented by one kind of attorney. They are people who are accepted by the military commission's bar, and they range from, as you said, young military JAGs doing a rotation on a case to extremely well-paid learned counsel pulled from the top of the criminal defense bar. And to be a learned counsel is a, as you know, I'm sure, is a term of art in the American Bar Association for having represented a certain number of death penalty cases. You have had to have worked on death penalty cases. So in the instances of the 6 people who they seek to execute by military execution, they are entitled to a learned counsel, and we are paying for them. And we pay them, and they're the learned we pay everybody. We, the American people, pay everybody who's practicing law at the war court, with the exception of one team that's loaded with pro bono guys who I don't know how they're going to last, but they're new to it. And we pay the prosecution, and some of them are in uniform, and some of them are civilians. We pay the defense attorneys the same. The judge is an Army colonel who was supposed to have retired about 10 years ago and is called back every year. The great unknown is whether he is getting both his retirement pay and his active duty pay. But he's been at it for a really long time, and he goes down there and I think works very hard. The other 66 detainees include 35 men who, through a series of review panels, some of them dating back to the Bush administration, have been deemed releasable, meaning they have no war crime they could ever charge them with. They have no intelligence to offer us. They have been deemed through intelligence analysis, to particularly the ones from the Bush years, to be able to be relocated to a setting where they might be continued to be detained, but we don't need them anymore. They also include people who have been, like the fellow this morning's paper, who have been more recently found to be approved for release to security arrangements, which usually involves they're not allowed to travel outside the country that takes them for a couple of years and probably get put through some sort of rehabilitation program by a board that represents the Secretary of Defense, the Attorney General, the Secretary of State, the Director of the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence, the Director of Homeland Security, and the Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. They look at the files and they decide that those people are eligible for release. Those people have attorneys too. Not all of them. I'm always surprised after all these years that when I come across a detainee who's been cleared for release and he has no lawyer. Because the first thing I do is if somebody's coming up for a hearing is I call up the lawyer and find out where does he want to go? What does he want to do if he gets out or once he's gotten out? The forever prisoners is a expression that we, the Miami Herald, coined to the incredible annoyance of the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Detainee Affairs, because he gets mad. It's now her. She doesn't like it either. And it's based on the theory that we are holding war prisoners down there. They aren't POWs because we don't consider them POWs because we don't consider them to represent a country that's a signatory to the Geneva Conventions. But they're war prisoners. We, the United States, believe that they fought and represented a foreign fighting force that we, the United States, legitimately can keep off the battlefield for the duration of a war. That's what POWs are. The problem with this war is there is nobody on the other side to surrender, which would be the thing that would traditionally end the war and allow that prisoner to go back to his country or his whatever. And so they are forever prisoners in a forever war. The technical term is Law of War Detainees under the Authorization for the Use of Military Force 2001, more colloquially called indefinite detainees. And they have lawyers, and those lawyers are, okay, so the ones who aren't in the death aren't in the war court, they have lawyers who are habeas counsel, and they're people who have volunteered from across the bar. At first, nobody wanted the cases, because if you think back about how raw it was back in those years, nobody wanted to volunteer to defend these people or to represent these people. But eventually, starting off with some very liberal civil liberties organizations, they started filing these unlawful detention petitions, habeas corpus suits, and it became very fashionable. So some of the best firms in the country have a pro bono unit and represent. Frequently, because travel to Guantanamo is so difficult, and access for the attorneys, while not as difficult as, let's say, for a reporter, they get to stay in officers' quarters, involves long periods of travel. They're increasingly sending their junior associates down because you don't want like the big paid lawyers spending 5 days down at Guantanamo for a half-hour meeting with a lawyer. I wanted to say something about the photographers because there's lots of them in the room here. The photographers, because there's lots of them in the room here. The photos in this book are in black and white, and in some ways they don't do justice to it. But the cover, which is by Pat Farrell, shows sort of what it was like in the crude old days at Camp X-Ray, which is what most people know about Guantanamo. It is now based on the decision of the current commander who brought his Mercedes to Guantanamo, off limits because he doesn't want that story to be told. But as awful as it is to be a reporter at Gitmo, it can be as satisfying. You can learn incredible things. You have the liberty to write, and if you can get it past your editors, tell people. And you have the ability to ask questions. That's another one of my editors who put up with me, Juan Vasquez. All these guys, like when I was getting in trouble, fought for me and kept me there. So, I really do appreciate all the effort they put in. But we can learn things, and we can ask questions, and we can write. I can write about the audio on Walt Michaud's video that the censor erased. And I can say what that prisoner shouted in my story. But to be a photographer at Guantanamo, it has to be one of the most humiliating assignments ever. I mean it, and I say this because I'm grateful every time they agree to come down with me. They take pictures, they labor to try to figure out how to take a picture that tells the story and meets the requirement of his mother shouldn't be able to recognize him. And what's so amazing about that is his mother's probably dead because he's been there for 15 years, but he certainly doesn't look like the child who left home. And so they struggle and labor to find ways to tell a story. And then they take their photos, because that's the contract, to one of the youngest, most inexperienced public affairs officers, who are not officers, they're enlisted, into a little room, who loads it up on this government laptop and goes through in absolute fear of the commander, who drives a Mercedes, will call him in and say, how did you allow this photo to get out? And so you have these photographers who believe that they've done the spirit of the rules, and they've taken pictures. I mean, we had a recent experience where Jose had imagery that from his trip that was fuzzier? Less revealing than a picture that Walt had taken from his trip, that we all agreed met the requirements and was cleared and has been published on multiple occasions. And this poor young soldier who's in fear of doing his or her 9-month rotation, putting on a uniform, having possibly, come from civilian life, is put in the position of deciding, do I delete it and destroy it, or do I keep it? And often they're photographers themselves, or they want to be journalists when they grow up. And I know that some of them feel, because I know these people, terrible about what the position they've been put into, which segues to something that Mark Seibel, who went to the Pentagon to fight for better rules, once said, why would you put the person who's responsible for driving the reporter to breakfast, making sure that the power is on in their tent, and give them the responsibility of being the censor? It just doesn't make sense. But that's what they've done down there. So to you photographers who keep coming back with me, I think I have one of the best jobs down there, and I thank you for coming back every time you do. Are we done? No.
It's you.
How do you feel about? Thank you. How do you feel about Congress's standing in the way of President Obama's attempts to close Guantanamo and, house the prisoners on U.S. soil?
I don't actually how do I feel about it? If the president believed he actually had the commander-in-chief authority to do it in defiance of Congress, he would do it. So, under our system, Congress has thwarted him, and he seems to believe, based on his legal opinions, that they have the power to thwart him. That's the system. My approach to this whole thing is not where they should be. That closing Guantanamo in the president's vision is taking these last 40 or 50 prisoners and putting them somewhere else. We called it Guantanamo North. It would be, we even haven't talked about the cost of this thing. It would be incredibly efficient. It would not require this churning, revolving force down there. It would mean that the churning, revolving force down there don't get to go on weekends and get scuba certified. It wouldn't be as fun for them down there. It would be a more, excuse me, people, professional operation if you put a small, this thing was created as it went along. It's this sprawling infrastructure capable of holding, more than 1,000, depending on how you want to house them. You could put, I think, 2,200 tons of prisoners in there, depending on what we would consider to be humane by our standards today. So it's an operation in waiting to be used, but at this point it's incredibly inefficient. So Congress, which has the purse strings, has decided that they like Guantanamo. Sometimes I think, actually, Guantanamo is Congress's prison because they hold the keys to it in many ways. But that's the system, I guess. Nobody asked about the economics of it.
I wanted to know about that exactly.
Okay, I did this really quickly, and then
Yeah.
we called it the most expensive prison on earth first. And that's because we talked to a lot of experts, and you can read about it in the book. A lot of the experts about what it would cost to do this. And it's not actually certainly the fault of the Pentagon. They were handed an assignment. They created something. They maintained it. It's temporary. There are reasons why they churn the people in and out and use the backs of the National Guard. But it runs on this very crazy budget that requires feeding, housing, entertaining, providing health care to all of these troops that come and go, training them, putting them in new uniforms, taking them out of old uniforms. It's extremely expensive. So Obama, in his campaign to get it closed, had a study done, and the figure that came out was that in 2015, fiscal 2015, it cost $445 million to run this detention center. And so the facile way to do it is to say there's currently 76 detainees there, divide it by that, so it's $5.85 million a year per detainee. If suddenly, I don't know, they knocked it down to, just do the math. Take away 10, divide it by, and you find out that it at some point, if there were, I think, 60 detainees there, it would be like $6.8 million a year per detainee. Anywhere that it went would not cost that much because it would be designed to hold a very discrete number. Fewer than 76. If you were to take away the 35 who were cleared, maybe that's the prison. But again, Congress likes Guantanamo. Congress loves Guantanamo. It's their favorite prison. Absolutely.
Why is that? That was my question, actually. I was interested in. Thank you so much.
I think, the first time I saw members of Congress come down there was very early on. It was a couple of weeks into Camp X-Ray, and they all got to inspect, see the war prisoners. Remember, Congress was very, very, people thought, possibly correctly, that they were a target of the hijackers. And like much of America, they wanted vengeance. So when they went down there in the beginning and they saw these people in Camp X-Ray in the cages, and the message of America at that time was, we got him. We can debate about whether we got him or whether the CIA got him, but okay. And it was satisfying. I've always maintained, and you can find the story, that it was the cheapest day trip to the war on terror you could get from Congress. You can go to Andrews Air Force Base, get a little Gulfstream, go down, take a picture of yourself in front of, the Camp Delta sign, and put it in your fundraising literature. And, I think there are generally people in Congress who believe that if you move these people to somewhere in the United States, it would put a target on that particular prison, that they would be people who are terrorists who would like to attack that prison more than other prisons where we keep terrorists. I mean, I don't think that their concerns are to be dismissed, but that's what it is.
First, thank you very much. And I want to thank the Miami Herald. I'm a longtime subscriber, and every time I go to my door in the morning, I see a thinner and thinner Miami Herald. And then I turn to my husband, and I always say, is there something more to the Miami Herald? So I just commend you and your group there for supporting such an interesting topic. I'm wondering now, in which way are you hopeful in any of this?
I hope that we have a trial someday. I hope that I can cover a meaningful, transparent trial of the 5 men accused of putting together the 9/11 attacks. I hope that America will have an opportunity to watch that trial more than through an article in the Miami Herald. I hope that the people who are in positions of responsibility will undo some of the draconian restrictions that were put on reporters through no fault of our own, and get back to a more meaningful process of answering meaningful questions. Because, I mean, again, look at the book. It's not like we pull, we don't give or take sucker punches. We write the story and we try to put in all the various explanations for things, and when the military does not participate in it, the story hurts for the lack of explanation. There's so many examples of that, I'm not going to go there. Some people say, do I want it to close? I'd like another assignment, but I'm not. but there's a certain satisfaction in knowing this as well as I do. And I don't think that we should be pushed out, scared away, or, threatened and menaced. Do I think that if, I used to say when they were talking about moving the detention center to Illinois, Michigan, Illinois, there was a place, Dick Durbin, Illinois. They were talking about moving it there. I was thinking, okay, that's my exit strategy. Then it's the Chicago Tribune's problem. We got into this because it's in our backyard. The Tribune needs to take it up. So, we're not in it to make a larger statement about war prisoners. They opened it up in our backyard. We made a commitment to cover this thing, and people went out of their way to try and shut us down, and it didn't work. You want to say? Yes, ma'am.
I know that you mentioned that you haven't had any contact with the prisoners themselves, and so you don't really know what has happened to them afterwards. But do you have an idea of what percentage of them have, the ones who have gone to other countries or the ones who have been repatriated back to their own countries? Just an idea of what?
Well, the ones I hear from are the ones who really haven't gotten in a lot of trouble, I can say. There is a report that is done, which is a very frustrating report in the manner of way many things in Guantanamo are frustrating, done by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, in which they track. And they have what they call the re-engagement reports and the recidivism reports. And what they have found is, and we don't know how these numbers evolve. So I'm very uncomfortable talking about them or writing about them because I do think we need a little transparency on it. But they've found that, I believe, 18%, I hate doing this because we're going out and, I know the overall figure, but when you do the overall figure, it distorts it. There are 30% of the detainees who were released in the Bush years, which numbered about 540. 30% are believed or suspected of or confirmed to have re-engaged. Re-engaged could mean a Taliban went back, Taliban. It could mean a Chechen went back, and Chechens, that sounds terrible. There were people who were like Moroccans who went back to Europe because they were European, French, who ended up dying with ISIS in Syria. And so, which is a very complicated thing because there are various moments, different parts of the opposition to Hafiz Assad were not necessarily our enemy, but they weren't allowed to fight, so they're dead, they're confirmed. The Obama administration, which has released far fewer detainees, about 168, and when I say about, I should say about 170, has a much lower recidivism rate. Maybe 4 or 5%, 6% suspected and confirmed. And that's, they say, because they have tailored transfer agreements to much more specific casework-like arrangements. The man who goes to Italy, they had a detainee go to Italy recently for resettlement. He won. It's like social work. He gets a halfway house and a sponsor and a partner, and they keep an eye on him and they help him find a wife and a family and settle. I'm not sure if it was your story, but wasn't there one, I think last year, who went married and he had problems with... We sent 6 to Uruguay. Yeah. But I think that probably the State Department would say, sure, Bolivia, if they would take them. Yeah, they did go to Uruguay, and a couple of them got married, and one of the marriages ended, at least one, possibly two, after a domestic abuse, which is clear, that program isn't helping those people adjust into. So every transfer is a different package, and there's a different arrangement. There's 20 in Oman, and I'd love to go there and write a story about it, but we're not going to pay for it, and they're not going to let me in, so everybody's happy. They have a program which is like you start off in a dormitory style setting, and then you get some, re-education and skills, and they're Yemenis, which is very culturally familiar, and in instances they bring them wives. The family has to arrange, and the family can come visit, and in Oman, which is a very stable, peaceful neighbor of Yemen, which is everything that Oman isn't, unstable, not peaceful, and an impossible place to send a Yemeni detainee, has so far been extremely successful it is a police state, in helping people settle in and find new lives. So yeah, there are horror stories. One of the Bush administration releases went to Kuwait and turned up in Mosul, Iraq, and blew himself up. So the Obama administration argument, which the recidivism figures seem to support, is that they are tailoring arrangements for each detainee. I was at Gitmo, and the Saudia Air 747s would land on that little airstrip. And I'd be watching these planes, and the Bush administration was loading up 18, 14, 16, and sending them back to Saudi Arabia and putting them into this program that lost track of them. But they lost track of them, and they became, some of those guys are the founders of Al-Qaeda of the Arabian Peninsula in Yemen. We drone them. What? Lots of people aren't nice guys, but at some point you let them go. If they're convicted of crimes, they serve a sentence. If they are, and by the way, no, they're not nice guys. Actually, some of them apparently are, if you listen to their lawyers. But the question is, if they didn't hate us when they got there in 2002 in shackles on their knees, do they love us when they're leaving in 2015 in shackles and blindfolds on the same cargo plane in the same shackled manner that they arrived? Are we?
Carol.
Yes, sir.
The ones that you gave that wonderful term to, the
forever
prisoners. I love it. Those are the subject of habeas cases, you said.
Everybody
and
is entitled.
Are they then brought to the United States District Court, the District of Columbia, to try a habeas case, or are they tried down there? And
virtually. Their cases are heard by the U.S. District Court in D.C., 333 Constitution Avenue. And the chief judge at the time, Royce Lambeth, set up a satellite dish on the roof, and that detainee can actually go to a site in Guantanamo somewhere and testify. That's not the right word. The habeas proceeding is an examination of evidence on whether someone is lawfully or unlawfully detained. The definition of lawful detention has become much expanded since the first habeas cases went to that court. Judges were finding people unlawfully detained, that the evidence was not sufficient, that they did not meet. And so the Bush administration and the Obama administration went to the appeals courts and got much more wider, rubbery definitions of detainable.
So the box score in terms of release in habeas litigation is not very good from the prisoner
So you can win a
standpoint.
habeas petition, but you don't leave Guantanamo. There's a very famous case of 18 men from China named Uyghurs not named, 18 men from China who were Uyghurs. They're an ethnic group of Muslims in China that I never heard of before I went to Guantanamo. And they were found to be unlawfully detained. Muslim men in Pakistan and Afghanistan, meeting the baseline definition of foreign fighters to whoever picked them up and gave them the Americans. But when they looked at their files and they looked at their cases, it became clear to this Judge Urbina that they didn't actually hate America at all. They were running away from communism. They had never actually joined with Al-Qaeda. They were definitely, in a runaway setting in Afghanistan. Their lawyer used to call it a Uyghur village. I think it was probably more like a training camp. But the Judge Urbina found them unlawfully detained, ordered them brought to the United States, and was going to have them released into the custody of the Lutheran Church, which was willing to help them. And the Obama administration went to the appeals court and blocked it, saying, the executive decides immigration policy, not you, Judge. And those Uyghurs spent years, there's a story in here called Uyghurville, which is in a different detention setting, still a prison camp, but on their own with like PlayStations and the ability to order pizza, behind barbed wire, while the Obama administration searched the world for countries willing to take them. 4 went to Bermuda, 6 went to Palau. A man and his very mentally ill brother who wouldn't leave, he wouldn't leave, got Switzerland. Some went to Albania, and they're scattered. 2 went to El Salvador, but somehow turned up in Turkey, which I'm sure doesn't satisfy people about feeling that we have really good control on where these guys are.
Is a separate reason for congressional favoritism toward retaining Guantanamo the fact that there is a group of lawyers who believe that once on U.S. soil that the detainees would have, I hate to use the word enhanced, an enhanced set of rights to litigate or to get out?
That is the fear. The Obama administration has submitted a Department of Justice opinion to Congress saying that that's not true. I don't really. I can imagine it both ways. I think we're wrapping up, right? I can imagine it both. I can imagine it both ways. Years ago when I first got to Miami, Mark Seibel, my editor, turned me around on the Venetian Causeway and sent me to you don't even remember this. Sent me to the airport to go to a parish in New Orleans, in Louisiana, where some Mariel Cubans were warehoused in a parish jail because they had been ruled excludable, but politics said they could not be sent back to Cuba. And I was shocked to know that in my country, people who were not convicted of a crime, but were excludable, could be held in perpetuity in detention. So there is a template for holding people who have been found to be unlawfully detained and continuing to hold them. I mean, the nightmare scenario, I think, for people is that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the man who has, after many rounds of waterboarding and abuse by the CIA, boasted that he did 9/11 from A to Z, would end up in a federal court. The treatment by the CIA would shock the conscience so much of this judge that he would find this man untriable, that we had lost the moral authority to try. This is the nightmare. Lost the moral authority to try this man for this heinous crime. And there would be no way to try him, no way to execute him, and that nobody would want him, and that he would walk the streets of Manhattan. I find that inconceivable. We've watched these New York federal courts prosecute terrorists on thinner evidence. I shouldn't call them terrorists, but making my friends in the military happy. Sorry.
Hi.
Go ahead, Mark.
I can't notice or help but notice that you have many yellow slips of paper in that book.
And I was wondering if you have something you'd like to read to us.
Okay, but are we almost out of time?
Yeah, and but you know, before we're out of time.
So one of the great pleasures of doing Guantanamo is that I don't have to write it as a military story all the time. I don't have to write it as a legal story all the time. That I do treat it like when I was a foreign correspondent in the Middle East. And so sometimes I get to write about cultural things and pop culture and what pop culture in a certain setting or in a certain place means. So here's the story I wrote in 2007, which it's going to probably surprise you because nobody paid attention when I wrote it, but I loved it. In Boston this summer, an Irish comedian staged a 1-hour show in an orange jumpsuit and a crown of thorns. He played Jesus Christ at Guantanamo Bay. As the Son of God, he was returned to earth and rattled nerves at New York's Kennedy Airport by making the mistake of saying, yes, he's willing to die for his ideals. Let's be fair, the comedian playing Jesus said, delivering his shtick from a stool in a black-lit theater. The guy works for U.S. immigration, and he's just seen a single male Palestinian traveling alone with suspiciously little hand luggage. Not very reassuring in this present climate. In the 5 years since the Pentagon started holding war captives in Southeast Cuba, the policy and the place called Guantanamo have seeped into popular culture in America and beyond. Fed by the internet, the phenomenon has spread across the planet with blinding speed, transforming a place into an icon, perhaps like never before. Not Nuremberg, not Pearl Harbor, not the Watergate. Post 9/11 Guantanamo has inspired a book of poetry, several stage productions, a punk rock songstress, a country song, a movie, 2 novels, more than a half-dozen memoirs, and a hip-hop concert in Washington, D.C. It even made a cameo in Michael Moore's latest shock doc, Sicko, as a metaphor for American health inequities. Collectively, they convey antipathy for the policy, a political theater of sorts, far removed from the base whose messages of humane custody of would-be anti-U.S. fanatical terrorists. An example. Singer-songwriter Patti Smith's dirge, Without Chains, about life after years in Guantanamo for the German-born Muslim ex-detainee Murat Kurnaz, whose tale captured the New York artist's imagination. Can I just do an aside? I'm the Guantanamo reporter. I got to call it Patti Smith. And as you will find out later, Charlie Daniels. Quote, I wrote as a citizen, Patti Smith said while on summer tour in Boulder, Colorado. I don't have any political rhetoric or deep knowledge about these things, but just as a human being and a mother, I found it horrifying. I think that the idea of some kind of political prison where people can just be put there because there might be some suspicious activity and just be left there, to me is horrifying. Kurnaz's homeland has in fact been fertile ground. He's already published his memoirs in German, with an English translation due out in the next year. Meantime, a 2004 novel by a German literary critic, Dorothea Deichmann, about life behind the razor wire, as seen by a fictional prisoner, Rashid, is due out in English. Australia, the homeland of former captive David Hicks, has been a lab for artistic enterprise, sculpture, dance, music. And, as with most political popular culture, the message is overwhelmingly dominated by opponents of the policy from the left. When country legend Charlie Daniels entertained at the Navy base in 2002, signaling his support for the prison camp, he improvised new lyrics to an old hit and came up with this. The devil went down to Gitmo, just looking for a Taliban. The troops roared with delight, but Daniel said that he performed the song only twice, both times at Guantanamo, as a spur-of-the-moment kind of thing. It never occurred to him to record it, he said, calling entertainment as opposition just a Hollywood thing. I ain't afraid of no kind of backlash. I ain't afraid of nobody. I'm not a politically correct person. I'm 70 years old, and I've been pilloried by the best. On another track, historical accounts are still coming off the presses even as America debates the wisdom and benefit of continuing to keep captives in legal limbo there. In Illinois, law professor Mark Falkoff has published Poems from Guantanamo, crude English translations of flowery Arabic and Pashto verse written by 17 captives from behind the razor wire. The former U.S. Poet Laureate Robert Pinsky wrote in a blurb that the poems deserve, quote, not admiration or belief or sympathy, attention. Gore Vidal declared, at last Guantanamo has found a voice. The poems speak of desperation and humiliation, telling a story starkly different from the packaged tours for press and distinguished visitors that the Pentagon has staged weekly since bringing in the first captives in January 2002. Navy Commander Rick Haupt, the prison spokesman, said the command staff at Guantanamo hasn't, quote, reviewed the poetry yet, but he said by email that the title suggests the lawyers, quote, exceeded the limitations of their access to the captives arranged with the courts. His Pentagon counterpart, Commander Jeffrey Gordon, told reporters on their publication in June that the poems were, quote, another tool in the battle of ideas against Western democracies against whom they are at war. The anthology's editor, Falkoff, said the Pentagon has not filed a protest over the poems with any of the U.S. lawyers whose detainee clients contributed to the book, which is on track to be the best-selling U.S. poetry anthology this year. It was 2007. 5,000 copies were sold in the first 6 weeks, prompting the publisher to print 5,000 more. In a market where most poetry anthologies have an initial 2,500 book run. Collectively, the ubiquity of the name Guantanamo is 21st century popular culture, coupled with its international controversy, is evolving into a linguistic shorthand. From the 20th century, Watergate has emerged as a code word for scandal, Munich for appeasement, and Auschwitz for the death camps. But there is still an emerging consensus on the meaning of Guantanamo. I should say there is still no emerging consensus. I'll skip to my favorite man in Boston. Performance art, meantime, has appeared in pockets of outspoken opposition to Guantanamo, notably in Australia and Britain. It was no coincidence that A.B. Philby Bowman chose to do his Jesus shtick in Boston, an Irish Catholic stronghold, but also a stronghold of liberal politics. By telephone from Boston this summer, Bowman said he took the show to America after sell-out performances in Dublin, Belfast, Galway, and Edinburgh. It blends his opposition to U.S. detention policy with an emerging career as a stand-up comic. I do think that Guantanamo is unchristian, he said. Jesus said, what you do to the least of these, you also do to me. So if you believe that, in a sense, he is in Guantanamo. Bowman, 26, comes from an Irish Catholic side of the Great Divide in his homeland. His grandparents, he said, were practicing Catholics. His parents chose agnosticism, and he declares himself an atheist. The thesis is, as a Palestinian willing to die for his cause, he winds up in indefinite detention in southeastern Cuba and ruminates on U.S. policy. But dressing up as Christ himself and quoting God? Quote, people say it's blasphemous, but I say it's not as blasphemous as torturing people. For the record, the Pentagon and prison camp spokesman described the treatment of captives as humane. Vice President Dick Cheney point-blank told Larry King Live recently, we don't do torture. All enhanced techniques for interrogations, he said, are carried out with the permission of Congress. Still, the perception of mistreatment has become synonymous with the place and the practice of indefinite detention at Guantanamo. In mainstream movie houses, Michael Moore bobs just beyond the base in his latest leftist shock documentary, Sicko, making the military's offshore mission a metaphor for American health inequities. Moore has set up the scene by reminding moviegoers that the Pentagon has long boasted that it provides top-notch, free, universal health care to Guantanamo captives. It's a wily juxtaposition to his central theme of why the White House can't cure the national health crisis. Quote, permission to enter. I have 3 9/11 rescue workers, Moore says. They just want some medical attention, the same kind that the evildoers are getting. He doesn't get inside, and neither does the film. The prison camp spokesman Haupt said Sicko has not been shown among first-run movies screened nightly at the 2 base cinemas. Quote, we've not yet seen the movie here, either in our theaters or on DVD, he said by email. But we've read the reviews.
Thank you, Carol.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. Wow. Thank you very much, Carol. Folks, you're watching online, give us a call at the store. You can order your copy. We'll get it signed for you. You got to limit yourself to 5 copies apiece, though, however. Those of you here, the books are for sale behind the counter. Carol will be sitting right here signing the book. That was a fascinating discussion and interactive event. Can you please give another round of applause for our author, please? And for you, those of you here, stick around. We got some live music in the courtyard, our great restaurant, and the bookstore itself. Thank you all so much for coming.
Have a little public service announcement. If you're buying the book.